Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. As she said, I'm Josh Ottow. I'm the assistant principal at Yarmouth High School. I've been a school administrator going on 8 years now, assistant principal the whole time. I'm at Yarmouth now. I was the assistant principal at Mount Ararat High School in Topsom for several years, and I was a history teacher there as well. I also serve on the advisory council for the Maine Youth Court. I'm very passionate about the issue of restorative practices in schools. And so I've been to many conferences similar to this and sessions and meetings and things. So I feel like I have to just start by representing my profession a little bit. So how many of you have seen the movie Ferris Bueller's Day Off, right? Okay, so you know one of the main characters in that movie is the assistant principal, right? And you know what he's like. He's got the clipboard. He's sort of always out to catch, always out to find, always out to give detentions and suspensions. And I feel like I just need to represent my profession in that sometimes at these conferences you often hear the horror stories of schools and sort of how they don't practice restorative justice and how that means suspensions and expulsions and things like that. And that's often true. But I do want to say that, you know, I'm familiar with most of the administrators in southern Maine, and I can tell you that the norm among school administrators is to be restorative by default. And I know that's not always easy, and I've had some really tough cases that I've had to work on, but there's a lot of hardworking school administrators in southern Maine that are working to bring restorative practices into schools. Do we have a long way to go, and is there more work to do? Absolutely. But I feel like I want to give props to some of my counterparts at other schools. So this weekend at Yarmouth High School, like many other high schools in the state, was graduation weekend. So if I'm a little bleary-eyed, it's because we had graduation and project graduation yesterday. And so I was struggling to get up this morning. And as I was in the shower, I was thinking of a story. And so you might be wondering, well, what does the shower have to do with it? Don't worry, I won't go into details. But there is a connection, and that is that I was thinking about an incident that happened when I was a history teacher at Mount Ararat. And this would have been almost exactly 10 or 11 years ago. It was either 2003 or 2004. I can't remember exactly which. And Mount Ararat had a tradition of senior pranks. Yarmouth, my current school, does not have senior pranks. Dylan, don't get any ideas for next year, okay? Dylan's one of the juniors at Yarmouth High School. So we do not have senior pranks at Yarmouth, but Mount Ararat did. And so I know there's some teenagers here and maybe some parents of teenagers. If you're ever sitting around the dinner table and your teenager says, oh yeah, you know, we're just getting together tonight to plan this senior prank. And in the back of your mind, you're thinking, you know, is the school okay with this? You might even ask them that. And if they say, oh yeah, Mr. So-and-so, Miss So-and-so, yeah, they're all over it, they're okay with it. Let me just tell you right now, they're not, okay? School administrators hate senior pranks. And so 2003, 2004, whenever it was, let's just say Billy and Johnny, they were actually students of mine when I was a history teacher. They had this great idea to bring toilet paper rolls to school. And right at the end of the day, right before the last period, sort of just start chucking them in the hallway, right? They're teenagers, you know, they didn't think it through. Just a harmless prank, right? First throw, Billy, who was actually on the football team, had a good arm, really hucked one down the hallway. First 3 feet, hits a sprinkler head and knocks it off. If you know anything about sprinkler heads, when water comes out of one, it doesn't come out of just that one. It comes out of every single sprinkler head on the second floor right as period 5 was starting. Okay? So you can just imagine the disruption that caused. Imagine the havoc that caused. We had to evacuate the building. We had to send everybody out. They couldn't return back because actually there was some chemical in the sprinklers that got released, and so they had to get the hazmat crew in. There were baseball teams and softball teams that had playoff games that couldn't go to those playoff games because they couldn't get back into the building to get their stuff. School had to get let out early. It was a huge issue, big time issue. And I remember thinking back at that moment and thinking about some of the conversations I had with people around that time. I was a history teacher then, not a school administrator, fortunately. That would have been one of my worst days if I was the assistant principal. But I can remember the teachers being so mad And I can remember them saying, this is the question I remember, what are they going to do to them? What are they going to get? How many days suspensions are they going to get? Are they going to be allowed to march at graduation? This was the prevalent questions being asked. And I remember just being struck by that, because I knew Billy and Johnny. They were in my class. And I talked with them after the fact. And I knew they felt awful about this. This was not what they intended. They made a huge mistake, and they knew it. And I also knew the school administrators that were trying to deal with this in the best way. And I remember them talking about really what are they going to do? And they were really kind of puzzled what to do. What they ended up doing was suspending Billy and Johnny, which was interesting because they were seniors, so they're actually done with school. So they didn't really feel like, so the teachers were feeling like, I can tell you that the students and their parents felt really bad. They knew the harm that they were caused, and the school administrators just sort of threw their hands up and didn't really know what to do. And I remember the whole thing leaving a bad taste in people's mouths. And I think about that a lot as I talk about restorative practices today. And I guess my question for you is, based on the situation that I just described, as you're hearing my presentation, think about how could Maine Youth Court have helped that situation? In what ways could it have helped move the students, the school, the community forward to a more positive place based on a really bad situation? So, I'll start by saying why, personally, I'm interested in restorative practice and restorative justice. And I think for me it comes down to one key point, which is that the traditional school discipline and the traditional juvenile justice system, I feel, is not the best response for those certain young people that absolutely need an appropriate and effective intervention. So you got the two models of sort of discipline in schools and in juvenile justice. You have the traditional model, which is sort of the Ferris Bueller model, right? I like to call it adults imposing their will. You screwed up, therefore I'm going to tell you what the consequence is. I often think about that scene from Wizard of Oz with the Wicked Witch of the West, I think. I get them mixed up. I'll get you, my pretty, and your little dog too. Right? It's like adults opposing their will, like ha ha ha. And that's kind of a wide example, but I think about that a lot because I imagine sometimes that's how teenagers are thinking about it when they're going through it. The reality is the traditional system, I feel and I've seen, does work well for some students. I was one of those students. If I got a detention, and I did get one for throwing an apple in the lunchroom, I got called down to the assistant principal's office. Mr. Winiarski, I went to high school in a very Polish-heavy area of Wisconsin, so literally everybody in the school, except for me, had ski at the end of their name, so much they just called me Ottow. Like okay, fine, just call me Ottow. I don't have a ski at the end of my name, but, so Mr. Winiarski called me into his office and said, okay, Ottow, you threw an apple, you get a detention, it's Tuesday after school, be there, and it took about 30 seconds, and I was out. I will say, though, the meaning that really I got out of that wasn't so much the detention, was that he called home, and I had to go home and talk to my parents about it, and that was a big deal for me. And I will tell you that was the traditional system, and that system worked fairly well for me. But, as I said before, those that need an appropriate intervention the most, these students that are experiencing behavior issues in school that then enter into the adult justice system, these are the people that need effective interventions the most. And the reality is, I feel that some of those traditional interventions just aren't going to work with those students, and they need that the most, and it's our mission and our goal to give them that. I think about what the renowned child psychologist Ross Greene said. He said, all students will do well if they can do well. All students will do well if they can do well. And there's a really profound sort of assumption or backing to that really does kind of fly in the face sometimes of the traditional system. There are often assumptions made about students who are misbehaving, who are getting in trouble in school and with the law. And what's really behind this statement is that if there is a misbehavior, it is due to an underlying issue. an underlying barrier that this child is having a hard time getting through. So it's our mission as a school to address that underlying barrier. So just like if a student is in math class and has some learning disability that impacts their ability to understand certain math concepts, we would not throw that student out of math class and say, sorry, you're not cutting it, try again later. We would provide direct interventions and try to pull up some of those math concepts so they're better at math in the future. And so what restorative practice is for me, and this is why I'm so passionate about it as a school administrator, is it is just that. It is an attempt to address the underlying issue. It is an attempt to help that student, that young person, grow. Is it always successful? No. But do we owe it to the students to try it and give it a good faith effort to try to help them improve so they don't have misbehavior again in the future? Absolutely. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about youth court, which is one practice at Yarmouth High School that we have that is a restorative practice. There are many, as you know, many types of restorative practices that can be put in place in schools. Maine Youth Court is one model of that. Yarmouth High School has been part of it for 2 or so years, give or take, actively part of it for 2 years. I'm not going to talk a lot about the details and the nitty-gritty of youth court and the referral process and the respondents and how the hearings work. There's actually a session being held this afternoon on Maine Youth Court that's being led by 4 of the students that serve on youth court. So what I'm actually going to do is just ask those 4 students to stand up right now. Remain standing, please. If we could give them a round of applause, because so they are from Deering High School, Casco Bay High School, Greeley High School, and, oh yes, Yarmouth High School. So without these students, Maine Youth Court would not exist, and really everything that Maine Youth Court does is because of the work of students. So thank you very much, you guys. I appreciate it. And really do, check out their session this afternoon. I'm sure you will get a lot of your questions answered. So in a nutshell, Maine Youth Court is a way to bring restorative practices in place when students have some sort of misbehavior. They are held accountable by their peers, which again, remember the Wicked Witch model is very different than adults sitting down with a student and saying, this is what your punishment will be. They are being held accountable by their peers. And they do so through a hearing where they're actually represented by peers as well. And I'll talk a little bit more about the process, but it's a way of really holding people accountable for their actions, but trying to boost their skills and boost their reconnections to the community at the same time. So as it says here, it's a diversion program. On this side is sort of the traditional model of punishment, shame, and exclusion. The Maine Youth Court model really fosters accountability, understanding, and connections. And as I said, rather than ostracizing youth that have some sort of misbehavior, which is what the traditional model often does, suspensions send students away from the community. Maine Youth Court keeps them connected to the community. The process is relatively simple. Well, no, that's not true at all. It's actually quite complicated, but in its sort of ideas, it's relatively simple. Its purpose is not to assess guilt or innocence. That's kind of when you think of court, you often think of sort of, you're guilty, you're innocent. That's not what Maine Youth Court does. It's a voluntary program. And so if young people are going to volunteer for it, they're going to do so because they choose to, and they've accepted guilt, quote unquote. A hearing is held. Prior to the hearing, that youth meets with some youth that will serve in that hearing. They gather facts, they get to know the students. A hearing is held that is totally 100% youth run. And through that hearing, the community's voice is heard. In particular, how is the community or how is the victim harmed by this person's actions? And in the end, they work together with the youth to try to find what they call dispositions, or what the traditional system would call consequences. So things that this student can do to repair the harm that they have caused. Often this comes in the form of community service, certainly not exclusively, but in the case of community service, it targets the areas where that young person needs the most support. or where they already have strengths. So again, as opposed to sending them away, it really fosters their strengths and helps improve their skills. In the end, they leave that hearing with some sort of timeline, and then they return back, usually within about 3 months, to see if they've accomplished those dispositions. Again, this is a real criminal in real school discipline cases. It's not mock trial or anything like that. It's the real deal. They refer both school discipline and criminal, and I say both, but it's tricky because in many cases, it's both. So if a student at Yarmouth High School comes to school with tobacco on them, there's a school policy that says if they're under 18, they get summons by the police. That policy's been in existence since 1996. So in that case, they have a pack of cigarettes on them, they get school discipline, and the police officer actually comes to the school and interacts with them as well. So there's an example where there's sort of 2 outside agencies, and then you add a third when that student gets referred to a juvenile community corrections officer. In the traditional system, those 3 bubbles, in the past at least, without youth court, had a hard time communicating with each other. And often the parents are involved as well. They're sort of the 4th bubble. And so you got 4 different places a student can get in trouble or feel like they're in trouble. And one of the goals of youth court is to sort of bring all of those together. So the other sort of core philosophies of youth court is that it's peer-driven and the restorative practice. So peer-driven is the part that I find the coolest in working with young people at my school in youth court. You know, the classic line is, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? So if I'm interested in bringing restorative practices such as youth court to my school, which one should I bring? Should I try to first make referrals as a school administrator? Should I think of, okay, I've got this many students getting in trouble for this number of things. Maybe youth court is an effective way to address those. So I'm going to start making referrals. So that's one chicken or egg. Or, before I even start making referrals, do I want to get a bunch of youth at my school really interested in the ideas of restorative justice, get them trained to be a youth court volunteer, and get them serving on real cases that might not involve students from my school? So which comes first, the chicken or the egg? This one comes first, from my experiences. That if a school gets a bunch of teenagers involved and interested in restorative practice and is interested in youth court, you're going to have a real organic growth of restorative practices and an interest and a buy-in and an intrinsic motivation to participate in restorative practices. So at Yarmouth, the model that we used was we fortunately had a lot of students that were really interested in the idea of youth court. Myself and others at the school, and with the help of the youth court organizers, got people interested, and trainings were conducted where those students started learning about restorative practices and then started serving on the court. And before we knew it, we had close to 16 or 20 volunteers that knew youth court, that knew the language of youth court, knew how the hearings happened, served on real cases. This all happened before we actually, as a school, referred a case. So that was awesome, because once I made that referral for a school discipline case, the students involved with that referral already heard about youth court. And they'd heard some good things about it. And some of the parents had already heard of it too. And it just made my job so much easier as a school administrator to get buy-in from the student and parent to say why youth court is a better option than the traditional system. One of the first referrals that we made involved 4 students that were facing an expulsion hearing. And so that was an ugly situation. I really had to step out on a limb and try to convince the student and parents that maybe instead of going through the expulsion process, and I actually had to convince the superintendent as well, that maybe that youth court was a better option. And because I had that buy-in already from the school community, it was that much easier. So one of the things that we did at Yarmouth that was helpful in this as well is also early on, while we were gathering volunteers to serve on youth court, we worked directly with the superintendent and school committee to create a youth court policy. I have a whole pile of them here. If anybody would like to grab one on your way out. This was enacted about a year and a half ago. And it took a long process to really educate the school committee and the superintendent on what youth court was and why it was a better option. Yarmouth, like most school systems, have a lot of black and white policies on the book, usually at the school committee level. If you bring cigarettes to school, this is what will happen to you. If you bring drugs to school, this is what will happen to you. If you deal drugs or bring a weapon to school, this is what will happen to you. So in the case of a school administrator, unfortunately, my hands are tied when it comes to a school committee policy, because my bosses, the school committee and the superintendent, have told me exactly how I need to handle that situation. So, and many schools deal with this. So what this policy does is it basically says, here's a list of offenses where the administrator involved, in Yarmouth High School, it was usually the assistant principal, they have the option of referring to youth court in lieu of the traditional consequences or in conjunction with the traditional consequences. So for example, smoking marijuana at school, 5 to 10 days suspension. If they do youth court, it's shortened to a 2-day suspension if they also agree to see the substance counselor at school. You see, that was in conjunction. There have been cases where we've made referrals in lieu, where they just did not receive any immediate consequences but did the youth court process instead. So there's a lot of ways that can happen. So I started with an example of the shower, literally, for me, and then back 10 years ago for the whole second floor of the school. So I end with another example, and this may or may not have happened at my school. So 3 boys skip class. 2 of them skip math class with the same teacher. 1 of them skips science class. They head out to the dugouts in the baseball field right behind the school. You know, there's 90-minute classes at Yarmouth, so that's a lot of time to be hanging around. They start getting their magic marker out and doing graffiti on the dugouts. They smoke some marijuana, and they get caught. So the traditional consequence, the black and white policies on the book say exactly what should happen to that student. What I have found, though, because youth court is an option at my school, I'm able to really engage with those students and those parents on how they can work to repair the harm. And I guess my question for you is, as you think about the case of the senior prank and as you think about this case, where is the harm done with a couple boys skipping class and smoking a joint? Well, let me think. What if I told you that that math teacher had just met with that student and his parents that morning because he was failing math, and they had put together this whole plan where they were going to work on math, he was going to stay after, it was going to be this whole thing, this big push to improve his math grade. What if I told you that there were several members of the baseball team that heard about this and were really impacted by the fact that there was graffiti in their dugout? So those are just a couple examples, but my point is there was a lot of harm done that's a little bit below the surface. And the final thing I'll say is that as a school administrator, I had a tremendous amount of leverage in that moment when I sat those students down in my office and I called their parents in, because it was a big deal to them and it was a big deal to their parents. And if I could present to them this idea of, here's this other option that doesn't involve as lengthy of a suspension or a suspension at all, and in the end, this is what you'll get out of the process. That leverage is something that's really hard to recreate. And you know, as a school administrator, Maine Youth Court works really well for that. So that's my presentation. Does anyone have any questions? Yeah?
How many school systems in the Greater Portland area use this, and which ones are?
So the question was, how many school systems in the Greater Portland area use this? I would say 3 school systems use it sort of in full. That would be Yarmouth, Portland, and Deering. I'm thinking I included Portland in all of those. I think Mount Ararat and Brunswick have all made referrals and have volunteers as well. I think there's more than 3 that just sort of have their tentacles in the system as well. Not as many as we'd like. We're working on it.
How did the faculty come on board? Was there skepticism? Were some for, some against? And how did you respond to that?
Yeah, great question. She asked, how did the faculty at Yarmouth, and I can speak to Mount Ararat as well because Mount Ararat went through a similar process when I was there. how do they respond to the ideas of youth court or restorative practices? It's definitely something you have to pay attention to and educate and don't take for granted. As I said about school administrators, the same goes for teachers. At the beginning, teachers, their default is to be supportive. Their default is to be caring. But when harm is done to their community where they work, or when somebody sort of is disrespecting what they do, there is a lot of harm done there. And unfortunately, that sometimes translates into the hang 'em high model of like, somebody screws up, let's go, let's suspend them. I want to know how many days. Let's kick them out, kick them out. And so, but I think if you really educate them on what the process is, and as Sarah pointed out, the statistics show that restorative practices such as youth court actually feel like more of a consequence to students. They sort of feel it more, and they get more out of it. And so teachers, when they hear that, they really are persuaded, but it's still work. I'd say every time I make a referral, I have to meet directly with those teachers that are sort of impacted by that behavior and just talk that through with them, because they have to kind of go through it every time. Question right over here.
What's the demographic of your typical peer leader, or the peers that you, and how do you recruit them? And how does that compare to the demographic of those who are referred to these peers? And how do you feel that this is affecting the overall school culture or relationships among the students?
Yeah, great question. The question was, how are students recruited? Sort of what is the demographic of those students recruited? How does that relate to the demographic of those that are referred? And then how does that impact the school culture? That's a great question. So I can only speak for Yarmouth. As Mike said, there are many other schools that participate. In Yarmouth, I would say the type of student that volunteers for youth court is a typical Yarmouth student. There really isn't anything that I can say about their demographics besides they do represent a wide range of students. In fact, they're recruited primarily through teachers and advisors that really think they would be good at youth court. Some of the students that have volunteered for youth court at Yarmouth have been in trouble before, and actually we feel that they bring a really great voice to the process. And so they can learn a lot just by going through the training that helps them as an individual. And the impact on the school culture is enormous. There's just definitely a nice vibe amongst the volunteers. It's kind of this cool, it's not a club, but it's something they participate in. And they really have a lot of camaraderie around that. But it also impacts how teachers talk to students about misbehavior in class. They start using some of the phrases I noticed. Like I had a teacher say, like, shout out, "How are you going to restore the harm?" And I was like, don't shout at them, but that's a great question. Like, that's a great way to process that with the students. So, it has an influence in a lot of different areas, but it's taken time, and it's still in the process. So I just want to check in. How much time do we have left for questions? One more. Okay, so I'll go over here. And then, by the way, if there's any questions that don't get answered, I'll be here, and as I said before, there's a whole session all about youth court, led by these 4 youth that will answer those questions.
If I have students that say when you said has these referrals, how do students there get training
Yeah. So she asked if a school is not actively making referrals, how does a student get trained? Short answer is, I believe any student from any school can be trained and be a volunteer. Youth Court is not an officially sanctioned school club or activity. It's a regional organization that local youth participate on. So really a school can't stop any of their students from participating. I think the key is, are they going to be aware of the trainings as they happen and things like that? Yeah, she asked how do students find out about the training. Ideally, it's if their school administrators and counselors and teachers are sort of putting out those notices. Yeah, that's a good question. Youth Court can't just go into a school and put flyers up. Facebook page, thank you. Yeah. So if anybody needs help communicating with their school superintendent or principals, I'm happy to help, and anybody in youth court's happy to help. We're happy to set up any meetings to try to get that word out there. Great. Maine Youth Court is the Facebook page. No? Great, thank you all for your time.